Flames licked at the sky from a village nestled deep within a valley, surrounded on all sides by the sharp, imposing peaks of pointed mountains. Tiny houses were being consumed by the fire, their walls crumbling inwards. From within the inferno, desperate shouts arose. People were yelling for the attackers to stop their destruction, their voices raw with fear and anger. They cried out against the encroaching Murim Alliance, a vast force that had descended upon the region and reached the gates of the primordial demon pavilion. Further shouts echoed through the air, a desperate plea to keep the invaders from breaching the pavilion's defenses at any cost. Inside the pavilion grounds, a scene of chaos unfolded. Many people were running with frantic energy, all of them heading towards the rising fires where the fighting was fiercest. Yet, amidst this panicked rush, a single figure moved in the opposite direction, pushing against the tide towards a grand building. This was no small skirmish. The primordial demon pavilion was under assault by the combined might of the Orthodox and unorthodox Murim Alliance, a force numbering well over 10,000 warriors who swarmed the grounds like countless determined ants. As the solitary figure ran towards a particular structure, an old man watching the scene unfolded called out his title, recognizing him as the inner administrator. The old man, his face etched with concern, stated that the administrator still had not made his escape from the dangerous situation. The protagonist paused his urgent movement, looking at the old man who had spoken, and acknowledged him, addressing him as Captain Sandojian. Captain Sandojian approached the administrator, his brow furrowed with worry. He questioned why Jin Yeomyung, the inner administrator, had no guards accompanying him in such a perilous place. The captain insisted that the area was far too dangerous and urged Jin Yeomyung to come away with him immediately. Jin Yeomyung explained that he had been on his way to retrieve the cult leader. In another part of the pavilion, a woman of striking beauty sat upon a chair, seemingly unmoving amidst the chaos. Captain Sandojian elaborated on her state, explaining that despite instructing all the followers to abandon the main mountain for safety, she herself had not stirred from her position. Jin Yeomyung placed a hand on the captain's shoulder, a gesture of weary reassurance. He stated with a somber tone that at this rate, their defense lines would inevitably collapse in less than an hour. He instructed the captain to prioritize his own safety and get away quickly. With a voice heavy with concern, Jin Yeomyung told the captain that after he understood the cult leader's intentions, he would then retreat with her. However, as the captain turned and ran back towards the raging inferno, Jin Yeomyung knew deep down that it was already too late for such plans. He let out a long, heavy sigh as he stood alone, contemplating his dire circumstances. Internally, he expressed his frustration, feeling that this time around, his efforts seemed destined to be a complete failure. He then turned and resumed his run, heading towards the large building directly ahead of him. A grand door stood before him, and above it, a plaque bore the inscription, Heaven Demonic Pavilion. Standing outside the imposing door, Jin Yeomyung called out, announcing himself as Jin Yeomyung, the inner administrator, and addressing the cult leader within. Receiving no immediate response, his tone grew frustrated, and he called out again, repeating his name and title more forcefully. Still, the silence from inside persisted. A third time, his anger flared even higher, and he shouted at the top of his lungs, calling out to the cult leader. At that moment, a soft, gentle voice drifted from within the palace, asking Jin Yeomyung to come inside. Hearing this unexpected reply, Jin Yeomyung was startled. He instinctively placed a hand over his mouth, his mind racing with surprise. He had genuinely not anticipated any response at all. With trembling hands, he reached for the heavy door, attempting to push it open. A thought flickered through his mind, wondering if she had perhaps heard him speaking in a casual manner earlier. He put all his strength into pushing the door, but refused to budge. As he strained against the unyielding wood, he continued to think, hoping she would understand his earlier informal address, since he had not begun speaking that way from the outset. He kept trying to open the door, pushing with all his might until exhaustion set in, his entire body beginning to tremble from the effort. After what felt like an eternity of struggle, the massive door slowly yielded, opening with a soft, creaking sound. Jin Yeomyung let out another long sigh of weariness. He muttered a curse at the door, complaining that whoever had opened it should have at least stayed there to help. He grumbled to himself that the situation felt incredibly heavy, a burden weighing down on him. Sweat poured down his face, beads dripping from his mouth and onto the floor, clear evidence of his utter exhaustion. With one final surge of energy, he gave the door a big push, sending it swinging open fully, and he stumbled inside the palace, huffing from the exertion. Across the large ground floor room, on the other side, sat the beautiful woman from before. Her dark hair flowed around her, framing soft pink lips, and sweat also glistened on her face. The woman spoke to Jin Yeomyung, observing that his martial arts skills were still worse than even a third-rate practitioner. Jin Yeomyung made his way towards where she sat, and upon reaching her, he voiced his frustration. He complained that while he was struggling with the heavy door, she had been simply watching and seemed to be enjoying his predicament. He added, perhaps more to himself than to her, that he was fortunate none of the other elders or captains had witnessed his struggle. The woman simply replied that indeed she had been watching, and furthermore, if any elder had seen him speaking to her so casually, as if he were completely at ease, he would undoubtedly be facing significant trouble. Hearing this confirmation, Jin Yeomyung groaned loudly, the realization sinking in that she had heard everything he had muttered. While this thought echoed in his mind, he began to climb the stairs leading up to the pavilion where the woman was located. Reaching the top, he knelt down on one leg, offering a formal greeting to the cult leader. The woman seated upon the long, black throne was none other than the 29th Heavenly Demonic Cult Leader, the Grand Master of the demonic faction, Cheon Yura, also known as the Heartless Demonic Empress. Cheon Yura gazed down at the kneeling Jin Yeomyung and spoke, calling him the weakest of all the inner administrators. She questioned why he had come seeking her out at this critical moment. With a face etched with concern, Jin Yeomyung looked up at Cheon Yura and asked why she was still there, exposed to the danger. Cheon Yura, her voice soft and strained, struggled to form her words. She spoke of the heaven-destroying poison, a terrible substance. She explained that it was a poison causing massacre and blood loss, a formless poison that melted bone, an affliction that crippled completely. Listening to her words, Jin Yeomyung clenched his fist and struck the floor in frustration. He exclaimed, demanding that she not tell him that he, referring to Han Yubik, had been given this poison. Jin Yeomyung gritted his teeth, stating that the poison had been administered to Cheon Yura by that detestable person, the demonic faction lord. The demonic faction lord was named Han Yubik, the man whom the cult leader herself had chosen as her husband. Han Yubik was also the very individual who had thrown open the gates of the 10,000 mountains, allowing the orthodox and unorthodox Murim Alliance to pour inside. He was, in essence, the leader of the traitors. Cheon Yura commented to Jin Yeomyung that Han Yubik had spoken these words to her before he left. He claimed that he had gone through an incredibly difficult time just to be able to approach her. As Cheon Yura recalled this conversation with the traitor, she lowered her head, her eyes partially closed, and sweat continued to pour profusely from her face. She continued her recollection, stating that Han Yubik had put in immense effort to win over the hearts of the former cult leaders and her own. The reason he had poisoned her, he claimed, was so that she might understand just a small part of the suffering he had endured. Listening to Cheon Yura recount the traitor's words and his twisted rationale for poisoning her, Jin Yeomyung was left awestruck and utterly disgusted by the actions of the heavenly demonic lord. He muttered, calling him a truly crazy person. Cheon Yura, regaining some semblance of her composure, looked at Jin Yeomyung and told him that he was indeed an interesting man. Jin Yeomyung looked up at her with a confused expression, telling Cheon Yura that this was hardly the time for such observations. He thought to himself, and perhaps said aloud, that she had always appeared so serious and confident, someone who was consistently stern and unyielding. Yet, in these final moments, she was actually laughing. Still kneeling, Jin Yeomyung asked Cheon Yura if it was truly too late for her. Cheon Yura speculated, her body struggling under the poison's effects, that the heaven-destroying poison had most likely already taken over her energy core. It was visible, her once bright energy core now surrounded by the dark, ominous flames of the demonic poison. Cheon Yura further stated that while she might have been able to contend with other types of poisons, this particular one was beyond her ability to handle. Hearing this, Jin Yeomyung felt a profound sadness wash over him. Leaning forward on the floor, he tilted his head down, gazing at the ground, and asked the cult leader, what if? He trailed off, unable to complete the question, then simply added, just, what if? Cheon Yura, surprised and perhaps a little shocked by his hesitant but persistent questioning, replied simply, yes. Jin Yeomyung, feeling slightly less anxious and more at ease despite the circumstances, laughed softly and said, yes, that's right. Didn't we talk about this in the past? He then recounted something he had once said to her, that he had saved his world in a past life. Cheon Yura, leaning back on her throne, remarked that it was difficult to believe someone like him could have possibly saved an entire world. However, she added, giving Jin Yeomyung the benefit of the doubt, let's say it is true. She then questioned his motive, asking why he was trying to plant hope in her. If such an opportunity for reincarnation existed, she reasoned, he should be fully occupied with his own affairs. Hearing the unexpectedly gentle response from Cheon Yura, Jin Yeomyung placed one hand over his chest as if bowing slightly. He explained that, firstly, he was someone who could not tolerate being betrayed. He added, secondly, that this was also his way of repaying the help he had received from her. Hearing what Jin Yeomyung had just said, Cheon Yura was taken aback, a flicker of pleasant surprise in her eyes. She questioned softly, seemingly to herself, my help? At this point, Jin Yeomyung looked up at Cheon Yura, telling her that there was no need to dwell on it. He recalled their earlier encounter, explaining that he had simply been presented as one of the candidates for her political marriage. He added that this was probably what she thought had happened between them. Cheon Yura offered a soft smile, her eyes drifting to look away from Jin Yeomyung as she questioned again. Reincarnation? Jin Yeomyung, a soft smile and a hopeful glint in his eyes, asked Cheon Yura once more, if I truly reincarnate, as you said, what would you do? He continued, explaining that even if she reincarnated, she would not remember what was happening now. Despite that, he had resolved his heart. The traitors of their cult, all the despicable members of the orthodox Murim Alliance who had invaded the 10,000 mountains, and the shadowy third-party group that had orchestrated the entire incident. He declared with an angry expression in his eyes that he would use his very soul to slaughter them all. Jin Yeomyung reiterated his question to Cheon Yura, his voice pleading. He asked her to please tell him if there was something she truly desired, promising that he, who would remember this day, would do his utmost to fulfill it. Cheon Yura shifted her position on the throne, placing one leg over the other and resting a hand against her chin. She leaned forward, and with a slightly teasing tone, she cheekily asked Jin Yeomyung if he would mind seducing her. Hearing this unexpected request, Jin Yeomyung was left utterly dumbfounded. His eyes widened in surprise as he questioned if he had truly heard correctly. He added that while he felt confident he could prevent Han Mubik from becoming the demonic faction lord in a new life, he was not at all confident about becoming her romantic partner. Hearing Jin Yeomyung's candid response, Cheon Yura's expression turned angry. She stated that she knew he hated her. Jin Yeomyung added honestly that she must surely know such a thing was close to being impossible. He further explained that a romantic relationship required both parties to be willing. And to be frank, when she had been the young cult leader, she was simply a tyrant whom no one could stop. In the background, a bizarre sight could be seen. Fallen figures on the floor with their souls comically rising upwards, a visual representation of the chaotic power dynamics. Jin Yeomyung added that she had crushed every single man who had dared to approach her, not only rejecting them, but seemingly breaking their spirits. This, he suggested, was one of the reasons Han Mubik had ultimately become the demonic faction lord. He was the only one who could tolerate her formidable temper. Cheon Yura, feeling a touch of sadness at Jin Yeomyung's blunt words, said quietly that he did not have to do it if he truly did not wish to. With that, she turned her face away from him. She murmured softly to herself, almost inaudibly, who said it was impossible. At this point, Jin Yeomyung rose from his kneeling position and began to slowly climb the stairs leading towards her throne. As he ascended, he thought to himself, and perhaps muttered under his breath, that a romantic relationship certainly begins with someone who is interested. Cheon watched him as he climbed, lifting her head to look at the approaching Jin Yeomyung. She leaned down slightly and added to his thought, suggesting it could also begin with someone who is not interested. Cheon Yura was surprised by Jin Yeomyung's actions and words, taken aback by the unexpected shift in his demeanor. Shock cleared her eyes. With a gentle smile gracing his face, Jin Yeomyung declared that for her, Lady Cheon Yura, achieving such a feat was not at all difficult. Hearing his words, Cheon Yura was pleasantly surprised. She commented that it seemed a long time had passed since she was in her 30s. She lowered her head, covering her mouth with her hands, and confessed that his comment was a little embarrassing. Meanwhile, Jin Yeomyung was thinking something quite different. Looking at the emotion she was displaying, he thought to himself that she was incredibly beautiful. His gaze narrowed slightly as he looked towards Cheon Yura and spoke again, asking her to promise him one important thing. Holding onto a part of Cheon Yura's dress, Jin Yeomyung asked her to forgive him if he spoke harshly about her past self. He added that if she possessed any weaknesses, he would greatly appreciate learning about them. Cheon Yura met Jin Yeomyung's gaze and continued to stare at him, a steady, unwavering look that made Jin Yeomyung feel quite flustered. Cheon Yura then stated that if their conversation were ever to be revealed, she would kill Jin Yeomyung with everything she had. She reminded him that she was only saying this once, so he needed to listen very carefully and ensure he never disclosed any part of their discussion. Her tone was stern and held a clear threat. Jin Yeomyung shivered slightly at the intensity he saw in Cheon Yura. He stumbled over his words, managing to say okay, along with other jumbled sounds. Still kneeling, his body trembling slightly, he remarked shakily that she had indeed been quite formidable back in the day. Cheon Yura retorted sharply, telling him to be silent. However, she was also visibly embarrassed, moving her gaze away from him. In a softer tone, she then stated that it seemed their conversation had reached its end. A feeling arose that other people were about to enter the palace room. Without further delay, a group of individuals gathered and entered through the same large door Jin Yeomyung had struggled with just moments before. Cheon Yura looked up as they entered, and Jin Yeomyung observed that the intruders had managed to make it this far. Cheon Yura then made a grim joke to Jin Yeomyung, saying that she could allow him to die peacefully if he wished. Jin Yeomyung, in turn, jokingly declined the offer. With a confident, slightly smug voice, he declared that if it was possible, he wanted to witness everything until the very end, his gaze fixed on Cheon Yura. Simultaneously, the leader of the Orthodox and unorthodox Murim Alliance, the supreme figure named Gwanhyun, looked upon both Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung. He spoke, expressing his thought that he had lived long enough to witness the fall of the demon cult during his generation. Gwanhyun further stated that it was an honor for him to be able to witness the downfall of the demonic cult firsthand. Hearing these words, Jin Yeomyung's anger flared once more. He shouted out towards the group, asking if they even knew who they were keeping at their side, clearly referring to Han Mubik. Gwanhyun replied confidently, a wide grin splitting his face and his eyes sharp as he pointed toward Han Mubik. He identified him as the so-called heavenly divine dragon, the one who had endured disgrace for the sake of the martial world, the Jianghu. Jin Yeomyung let out a surprised but quirky laugh, mocking the title. He ridiculed Han Mubik for walking among the orthodox factions bearing such a grand title. Han Mubik, pointing his sword directly at Cheon Yura, shouted out, addressing her as the heartless demonic empress, the grandmaster of the demonic faction. He declared that it was time for her to pay for her sins. Looking at the scene playing out before her, Cheon Yura could not entirely hide her surprise, but she responded with a touch of dark humor. She spoke mockingly, saying, "Oh, my beloved husband has returned." With a look of disgust on his face, Han Mubik responded to Cheon Yura, stating that everything he had done was for the sake of the Jianghu. Cheon Yura's expression turned serious, sweat still pouring down her face, her eyes sharp and piercing. She corrected Han Mubik, stating emphatically that it was all for the sake of the heaven-defying society. Was it not? Hearing this, the gathered people began to murmur amongst themselves, questioning the name Heaven-Defying Society. They had never even heard of it, and a ripple of confusion spread as everyone began asking what that even was. Even Jin Yeomyung was surprised by Cheon Yura's exclamation, and he thought to himself, the Heaven-Defying Society? Seeing the confusion among the gathered individuals, Han Mubik pointed his sword towards Cheon Yura and shouted at the alliance leaders and everyone present not to be fooled by the words of this witch. He claimed she was merely trying to create discord among them in her final moments. The gathered people, hearing Han Mubik's assertion, drew their swords. They took up fighting positions, pointing their blades towards Jin Yeomyung and Cheon Yura, preparing for the imminent battle. The leader, Gwon Hyun, stated that Han Yubik was correct and that the words of a demon held no weight. Another person in the group added that the cult leader's life was already hanging by a thread. There was no need to engage her in a one-on-one duel. They urged everyone to attack with full force. Hearing these declarations, Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung also prepared themselves, drawing their swords. With a confident stance despite her condition, Cheon Yura stated that even though she was poisoned, she could still handle the likes of them on her own. Gwon Hyun, a wild smile on his face, remarked that Cheon Yura certainly spoke with great confidence for a cult leader facing her end. At that moment, Cheon Yura released her aura, a dark red energy swirling outwards from her. Proclaiming the name of the heaven-slaying demon sword art, countless swords materialized around her, all gleaming with malevolent energy. Looking upon this terrifying sight, the people who had gathered to fight against Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung were stunned into surprise. Some even acknowledged the imminent danger, muttering that she still possessed such immense strength left within her. Gwon Hyun, undeterred, proclaimed and shouted out the name of his squad, the Golden Dragon Heavenly Sword Squad, and then gave the order to attack. With the sound of a unified cry for the assault, all the people who had gathered charged towards Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung, who were now surrounded by a swirling cloud of red and black swords. The scene then shifted. We saw Cheon Yura with blood smeared on her face, her eyes barely able to remain open. She spoke to Jin Yeomyung, asking him with a touch of dark humor if he was still alive. Jin Yeomyung, also covered in blood, looked at the cult leader, who was now impaled by countless swords. Cheon Yura, with her fading strength, offered a final thought, expressing gratitude that she was able to say goodbye to Jin Yeomyung before she met her end. Jin Yeomyung spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow, stating that the attackers had now retreated. Cheon Yura explained weakly that those who had come to attack them had run away from the heavenly demon Hull once he had activated the self-destruction array. Jin Yeomyung, not fully registering Cheon Yura's words, was consumed by worry for her state. With a concerned expression and wide, distressed eyes, he shouted out her title, Cult Leader. At this point, the fire was raging violently throughout the hall. Cheon Yura looked at Jin Yeomyung, asking him why he was crying. Unable to bear the sight of Cheon Yura in her current condition, Jin Yeomyung looked up, his hair matted with blood obscuring his eyes. He cried openly, stating simply that it was because he was sad. Cheon Yura extended her hand, now dripping with blood, and gently grasped Jin Yeomyung by the chin. She spoke his name, Jin Yeomyung, and then asked him again, her voice faint but firm, if he would indeed seduce her. Unable to maintain her composure any longer, Cheon Yura retreated her hand back. Jin Yeomyung, gritting his teeth against his sorrow, sadly sighed and replied, "Yes." Cheon Yura could no longer keep her eyes open. As they slowly closed, she gave Jin Yeomyung a brilliant final smile. She whispered that it was good to know he would keep his promise to her. With that, Cheon Yura fell backward from the throne. Jin Yeomyung hurriedly scrambled to his feet, attempting to support her, but she slipped away, falling down from the pavilion structure and into the raging fire below. Jin Yeomyung, his face streaked with tears, shouted that these were the final moments of his life. He lunged forward, grabbing hold of Cheon Yura as he too plunged into the destructive flames. The scene shifted again, now to a high cliff face. A solitary figure stood on a rocky outcropping, surrounded by a throng of people with their hands raised in celebration. The people were shouting praises towards the hero who had saved humanity, the guardian of Earth. Thanks to his heroic deeds, the gods had granted him 3 special advantages and had promised him 2 more chances to be reborn into a new life. Originally, the hero had planned to live his next life pursuing wild fun and enjoyment without restraint. However, the memory of Cheon Yura's brilliant smile and her final words to him, asking if he would seduce her, came flooding back. The hero, Jin Yeomyung, closed his eyes for a moment. He resolved that in this final life, he would dedicate everything he had to Cheon Yura. With that firm decision made, Jin Yeomyung opened his eyes. Suddenly, a confusing sensation, like a burst of cold water, jolted him. As his senses returned, he saw a bald man with a wide grin on his face shouting excitedly at him, calling him young master, and proclaiming that he was finally awake. Jin Yeomyung, surprised, called out the servant's name, Gu Cheol. Gu Cheol confirmed his identity, stating that it was indeed correct and that he was Jin Yeomyung's loyal servant. Jin Yeomyung thought to himself, observing the servant's youthful appearance, that judging by his face, he had definitely regressed quite far into the past. Jin Yeomyung was in a state of shock, drenched because of the water Gu Cheol had splashed on him. He questioned the servant about the reason for such an abrupt wash fashion, asking why he couldn't have simply woken him by shaking him gently. Gu Cheol replied to Jin Yeomyung, who was now seated in a chair before a dining table laden with a variety of meat dishes and scattered drinks. Gu Cheol explained that Jin Yeomyung himself had given the order to splash him with water if he happened to fall asleep. Jin Yeomyung felt a mixture of confusion and fear as he now realized the precise point in time he had regressed to, the moment he was about to be severely beaten by his father, the patriarch. This was when Jin Yeomyung was just 7 years old, a time when he had first arrived at the demonic Heaven Tower, harboring dreams of becoming the demonic cult's most notorious playboy. His father, the patriarch Azura, King Jin Gunake of the demonic Heaven's Jin clan, stood holding a jar of drink. He shouted at Jin Yeomyung, accusing him of sneaking into the upper floors and drinking alcohol before his coming-of-age ceremony. Jin Yeomyung vividly recalled that the last time this had happened in his previous life, he had been beaten mercilessly, like a dog, and dragged home by his father. Jin Gunake, holding the bottle by its neck, declared that the eldest son of the Jin clan had been knocked out by a single bottle of alcohol and at a party attended by heirs from other prominent families, no less. He roared at Jin Yeomyung, calling him pathetic. Realizing his father was consumed by anger, his head seemingly bursting with fiery rage, Jin Yeomyung hurriedly ran towards him. As he moved, the chair he had been sitting on threatened to fall backward, but Gu Cheol quickly caught it with his leg. Jin Yeomyung reached his father and attempted to explain the situation, but Jin Gunake cut him off swiftly, shouting at him to remain silent. Jin Yeomyung immediately knelt down before his father and responded, "Yes, sir." Jin Gunake expressed his disbelief that his son could be so weak. He stated further that if Jin Yeomyung was destined to be weak, he had better at least possess intelligence. With sharp, wide-open eyes fixed on Jin Yeomyung, Jin Gunake asked if he understood why he had come personally to drag him back home. Jin Yeomyung remembered that in his previous life, he had been beaten even worse because he failed to answer this very question. But this time, confident that things would be different and determined to make them so, he answered his father's query. He stated that it must be because his engagement meeting with the young cult leader had been confirmed. Jin Yeomyung's mind raced, recalling the details of that critical time. There had been many potential suitors, all vying for Cheon Yura's favor. The engagement meeting involved Cheon Yura, then a 17-year-old young cult leader, meeting with the elite heirs of the 6 great clans. This period was immensely important because a contest was being held to determine the young cult leader's future spouse. Jin Yeomyung remembered that during that past event, no one had been chosen. Because no match was made, the demonic faction lord selection tournament had proceeded, and the traitor Han Mubik had won the tournament, subsequently marrying Cheon Yura. Jin Yeomyung, still kneeling and dripping wet, promised himself internally that in this life, his final chance, that outcome would not happen again. Looking down at Jin Yeomyung, Jin Gunake stated that the only reason Jin Yeomyung, a man lacking talent and motivation, had been allowed to live until this moment was for this very purpose. It was widely known that Jin Gunake was a ruthless father, willing to use even his own son for the glory of their clan. With a stern expression in his eyes, Jin Gunake questioned Jin Yeomyung, "Can you win her heart and rise above the other heirs?" Jin Yeomyung looked up at his father, a confident grin spreading across his face. He replied that the other heirs of the 6 great clans would never succeed in winning her over. Satisfied by Jin Yeomyung's answer, Jin Gunake's wide grin widened further. He said simply, "Good." He then instructed Jin Yeomyung that if he didn't want to bring disgrace upon their name, he should at least focus on improving his self-defense martial arts. The scene then shifted to outside the pavilion, where Jin Gunake was walking away. Inside, Jin Yeomyung was thinking to himself, feeling a pang of bad luck at having run into his father the very moment he had woken up in the past. Looking down from the pavilion floors, Jin Yeomyung reflected that even so, This reincarnation was the best possible outcome he could have hoped for. Not only had he been granted 10 years, but he had found himself 17 years in the past in total, providing him with plenty of opportunities to change the course of events. Jin Yeomyung recalled the last words Cheon Yura had spoken in their previous life before their tragic end. She had mentioned that everything Han Mubik had done was for the heaven-defying society. Jin Yeomyung thought to himself that the heaven-defying society was likely active during this earlier time period as well. With an angry expression settling on his face, he looked down and declared internally that in this life, he would wipe them out completely, roots and all. Feeling scared by Jin Yeomyung's intense expression and the murmur he had just heard, Gu Cheol nervously asked, "Young master, what are you planning to do?" Jin Yeomyung, unaware that Gu Cheol had been standing behind him and had overheard his low mutterings about wiping out the heaven-defying society, nonchalantly turned around and simply asked, "What?" Gu Cheol countered Jin Yeomyung's question by asking what he meant by what. Gu Cheol reminded him that he had just boldly declared his intention to become the young cult leader's future spouse. Jin Yeomyung placed one hand to his face, thinking hard for a moment. With a surprised expression, he then asked Gu Cheol when he said that. That's all, folks. If you enjoyed the twists, turns, and epic power-ups, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss another legendary recap.